Morning guys, welcome to the workshop today. I'm here doing a little bit of work on my own car, which is the blue Fiesta that you see in the background, Ford Fiesta XR2. It was my first car. I've had it like 23 years, which is a bit ridiculous really, but yeah, I can't bring myself to get rid of it, so here we are. So yeah, doing a bit of work on that today. So it's been off the road a couple of years. As you can see, it's in a bit of a stripped down state, the reason being usual rust, of course. So I've spent quite some time doing the body work and getting it ready for paint. So next job will be to have it painted. But just to run you over the spec of the car, it was obviously a standard XR2 when I got it, but back in the early 2000s, probably like 20 years ago, I converted it to be the Turbo Technics spec. So it's got a T25 turbo bolted on the front of it, and then it had the single or twin choke downdraft carburetor that it blew through. It had about 7 psi of boost and did all right. It was always pretty quick. And then I stripped the engine, upgraded it to the RS turbo pistons and all the rest of it. A few years later, bike carbed it as well, so now it blows through a set of bike carbs. Did about 16 psi boost and about 210 brake horsepower. Never really fully tuned it, didn't have a dyno. I'd only just got the dyno at the time when I did that. And then since then the car's been off the road. So doing a little bit of a job on the carbs today, because one of the things that we see with the bike carbs, which you can see I've got them on the bench here, just stripped down into their component parts. The thing with these is on occasion you get the O-rings going dry and very, very hard. And what happens then is they tend to leak fuel, so they might only do it periodically. Mine wouldn't do it all the time, but it would do it now and again. So basically the problem is, this is where your fuel comes into your carburetors, that goes in between two carburetors. On each end of it is a O-ring. Those go absolutely rock hard, and then it will drip out of here. We have two more here, so there's like a bridging piece, little fuel rail basically, that goes in between carbs 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, as T-piece goes in between 2 and 3. Depending on your bike carbs, it might be slightly different arrangements. Some of them are 2 T-pieces that are joined by a piece of pipe, but either way, they've all got something like that with O-rings on the end. So if I just spin you around a little bit, as you can see on the bench, this is the remnants of the O-rings. They've got absolutely rock hard. That one in particular, it's not even recognisable as an O-ring. So that's the problem. So if you've got bike carbs and you find that on occasion you're getting a fuel leak, then it's likely that it's these. So the only way you can do it is to strip the carbs completely. So basically we had an aluminium bar that held them together. We had a long threaded rod that went all the way through and clamped them all together, and that's what holds the carbs in place. I've also taken off the choke bar. Okay, so that's where we're up to at the moment. So what I've done, I've put the O-rings on there and they're ready to go back together. Now the other thing to mention on these carbs is that you also have something like this, which is a vent from the float ball on each carb. So you can see that's a T-piece and it comes out. Now that is fine left to atmosphere on most normally aspirated cars, because that's all it would have done on the bike. It would have just gone into the airbox. So you don't really need to do anything with it. Even if the O-rings leak on that, it doesn't matter. It's only breathing to atmosphere, so it's not really something you need to be concerned with. But because this is a turbo one, these are actually used to pressurise the float balls. So because of that, I'm actually going to replace them on these. Whilst I've got them in bits, I might as well do it. But yeah, basically, you've got a leaky fuel, a fuel leak issue, then it is very possibly these that are the problem on your carburetors. So I'm going to reassemble these, put some O-rings on these, get them back together, and then I'm going to go through a little bit on the float valves, because that's the only other thing we ever see with these. Sometimes the float valves get old. I mentioned this in other videos, and when they do that, then the carbs tend to flood. You tend to get fuel coming out of these vents, which are at the top of the carbs, obviously. Now that's bad. It means the carbs filling up, it's not shutting off, and you're getting far too much fuel. It'll tend to throw a load of fuel into the engine as well. As I say, I've replaced the 4 O-rings on this T-piece as well. This is the breather T-piece. As I say, you don't really need to bother with it if you've got a normally aspirated application, but because this is boosted, I don't really want boost leaks out of these. So as a matter of course, I've just replaced those. So these carbs are basically ready to go back together now. Those can go back in. We've got new O-rings on the fuel T-piece and the fuel rails between each one. So the thing with these is the size of them. It's a bit of sort of depending what carbs you've got, they could be a different size. But we tend to find, well, obviously if you've got a vernier caliper, you can measure the groove for the diameter, and then we tend to find that they're either a 2mm O-ring, which is what they are, and then on this one we've got a 1.5mm O-ring. So I think they're 7 by 1.5. I think they're 6s by 2. Okay, so you need a selection of O-rings really, depending which carbs you've got. So yeah, we'll get these put back together. Okay, so we've got them back together. At the moment I've just screwed them together using the long threaded bar that runs through here. So that's the 4 carbs all bolted back together. As you can see, that's the fuel rail that I'm talking about there with its new O-rings on. We've got the T-piece in the middle, fuel rail at the other side between those 2 carbs. And then we've got the vent T-pieces in here, which I've also re-O-ringed as well. So they're back together. As you can see, these carbs have got our trumpet plates on there for mounting our trumpets. Now, obviously this is a turbo car, so this is actually, I've adapted this to make it suit a plenum chamber to pressurise the carbs. So that's the bottom of the plenum chamber. It's got its gasket still stuck to there. That'll go on like so. I've still got a lot of messy silicon sealer on there at the moment. Basically, that's the base plate for the plenum, which is a fabricated plenum like so. So a big chamber, obviously, that gets bolted down to that plate. So that goes over there like so, and we end up with a pressurised system boost hose on that side, obviously. And what we've got in there is something called a pitot tube, which is a clever little design which will basically uses it to pressurise the float balls, as I mentioned, using those T-pieces. And what that does, it actually enables, it's like an enrichment circuit. So it means we can run very small jets in these carbs, but still get the fuel in that we need. So at 16 psi making 200 horsepower, these have got absolutely tiny jets in. I think they're 125s. Whereas obviously on like a 160 horsepower Z-Tech, we'd be running like 150 main jets. So yeah, that's a very clever way of sort of making an enrichment circuit to help with the fueling. Okay, so just a word about float valves, because this is the #1 problem that we have with these carburetors. Okay, if anybody has fueling issues at idle, it's getting rich, it's coughing and bogging down, it tends to be because the carbs are flooding. And the reason for that is the float valves, just like in a Weber or anything else, we've got a little valve that lets fuel into this float chamber. This carb's upside down, obviously. This is the float chamber, which would be underneath. And the float obviously sits in the fuel. So what tends to happen is the little valve, which has got like a rubber cone on the end of it, the cone might go hard and then it doesn't seal. So instead of shutting off, it just continues to fill and fill and fill until it fills the carb up, and you get fuel coming out of the top of the carbs and going into the engine, which is what you don't want. So the valve, it has a little cone on it to seat and seal, but it also has a little spring in it as well, a little spring plunger. And the idea of that spring plunger is to take out the vibration at idle, and so that the valve doesn't vibrate open when we're idling. But what tends to happen is that spring tends to go weak, and you don't get that damping anymore. And when you don't get that damping, that's when the valve starts to vibrate at idle, and then you start to flood on one or more cylinders. So as you can see, that one's still not bad. It kind of holds its own weight, so that little bit of spring there is the spring sort of holding the float up. However, if we move to this one here, it's got absolutely nothing. No, it's completely dead. So yeah, it'll lift and it'll open the fuel, but there's no spring there at all, totally dead. So is that one. That one is as well, to be honest. So we've got one. Now I'm not saying that they won't seal, but if you've got vibration at idle, it could start to vibrate open, and that's when you get problems. So we're just going to whip those out and replace them, basically, which is very simple. We just undo the Phillips head there, the float will come off, and then we can look at swapping that valve out. It's very simple. We sell the valves on the website. There's 2 models, McCuney or Cayenne, and it can cover most of the carburetors that we deal with. That's the 4 floats removed, very simple, 4 screws to do so. And then we've got our float here, and as you can see, we've got the little valve just hanging off there. Okay, so as you can see on the bottom of it, it's got a little rubber cone, sorry, and basically that goes into these brass seats here and seals off basically. So what we're going to do is take those off and basically replace that component there. This is the seal, the cone seal, and as you can see on the top here, we've got a little plunger, and you can push that down, and it will still have a spring. Some of them actually seize up completely, but the spring tends to go weak, so we're going to replace those. Another thing worth mentioning, another thing I'm going to check and actually replace whilst I'm here, because I don't want to have to do this again, is this seat where the float valve goes into actually has a couple of O-rings around its body. So when it slides into the car body, it seals into the body. Now, as well as the float valves letting fuel in, those O-rings, if they go rock hard and perish, you can actually get fuel coming up between this brass seat and the aluminium body. So it's worth just taking those out. Again, it's just 4 screws to take them out, and then we can just have a look and renew them as necessary. So, as I mentioned, these are the 4 valve seats that we've pulled out, and we can put up a bit of a fight getting them out of the car body, as you saw there. But basically, especially if they're well corroded, these are actually in very good condition. So the O-rings don't look bad, so I doubt these would have leaked, but it's worth replacing them anyway. As you can see, it has a little gauze on the end of it, a little filter, but yeah, it's just a brass seat basically for your float valve. So we'll replace those O-rings, get them back in, and get these carbs back together. So that's the 4 floats back in position. As you can see now, look at that spring there, that is considerably better. So it actually holds the weight of the floats properly on each one. So we did not have that before. So that's what you're looking for basically. You need a good spring there, and that'll make sure that we're not getting vibration put into the valve and opening and flooding the carbs. We've now replaced the float valves and the O-rings on the float valve seats. It's time to test them. So I brought the carbs into our engine test room, which behind me we've got the engine that we test all our carburetors on before they go out, to make sure that there's no leaks like this, no fuel coming out, make sure they run on 4 cylinders and all the rest of it. But what we've done, so the initial check, we've still got the float valves off. What I've done, so we've got a bike fuel pump here running off this fuel tank, and we've just connected up the fuel to the fuel inlet. The pump is now switched on, but because all of these valves are sealing, then the pump is not currently running. So that's a good indication. If you've got a float valve leak, your pump will never stop running because it's constantly pumping fuel past those float valves. Whereas if those valves are sealing, then they're all sealed off and no fuel can flow. So obviously, being upside down, the weight of the floats is currently closing the valves. But what you can do is have a look here and just make sure that there isn't any fuel leaking out of any of either around the O-rings or of course letting fuel through the float valve. Now if I just pan you around a little bit there, if I give this a tap, we hear the pump run and we start getting fuel coming out of here, so we know it's working. If I lift it, we start getting fuel. So that means it's all functioning correctly, and we're happy with the float valves. So next stage will be to put it onto the test engine, make sure that they all run as they should. Got the carbs mounted on the test engine, ready to start up, but before we do that, I'm just going to flick the fuel pump on. And what we should hear is the fuel pump click, 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 click until the float valves are full, at which point it should switch off. So here we go. That's the fuel pump running. It'll take a few seconds to fill each float ball up, and then it should start to slow down and eventually come to a stop. And there we go, it's slowing down now, coming to a stop, and that's it. That's how a bike pump operates. It's called an interrupter pump, so that's how it works. It just comes up to a certain pressure and then eventually stops like that. Some of the pumps work like that as well, whereas some will run continuously, at which point you need a regulator just to keep the pressure down on the float balls. So once we're happy that it's stopped, we can start. if I put the ignition on, here we go again. There we go, we're up and running. So all of our carburetors go through this process. We put them onto this engine to make sure they're running on 4 cylinders, make sure that they pick up and rev. These have got quite small jets in, but even so, picks up and revs fine. We can also check the balance and make sure that the carbs are balanced. So now that I've found the carb balancer, I'll just run through the balancing procedure. These are a little bit out of balance at the moment, so if I usually start with the one that has the idle control screw on it, okay, which is this carburetor. So this is your master carburetor, and basically all you're trying to do is get the carbs to match. It doesn't really matter what they're pulling, because that will depend how far open the throttle is and how far you've got the idle screw open. But the important thing is they're all within 1 point of each other. So, starting on the master one, I don't know if you can see that there, but we've got about a 3.5. Moving over to this one, got a much higher pull there, we've got about a 5.5. So we need to do some adjustments on this middle screw. We move on to the outer one, again that's a strong pull, that's pulling 6. So these two appear to be pulling a lot more than this one. This one, again that one's down at 4-ish, just under 4. So these two are low, these two are high, so all we need to do just make an adjustment on the screw here. As you can see, between each set of carbs here is a small screw on the linkage, and that basically alters the butterflies relative to each other. Just pulling these two down now, and as you can see the idle screen's dropped. We've now got a good 4 on that one. Three and a half on that one. 4 on that one. It's a strong 4, so we'll just close this one down a little bit. You've got to be careful whilst you're doing this not to open the throttle with the screwdriver by pushing on it. That's a 4. That's a 4. That's a 3.5. And that's a 4. That's good enough for me. So these are ready to go back on the car out there now. Okay, so whilst I was putting the hoses back on these carburetors, I thought it was worth mentioning again how important it is to get these hoses seated correctly on the carburetors. A number of people who we get saying the carbs are falling off, they can't get the hoses to clamp on. If it's done correctly, it is absolutely foolproof. Okay, so this car, obviously being turboed, ran 16 psi through it. Okay, never once did it push the carbs off. Just mounted on these hoses, not braced to the engine, no extra support at all, just these hoses. Okay, so 1 bar of boost, well 16 psi, and no carbs falling off. Okay, so it's perfectly doable if you do it correctly. So the way to do it is to put them onto the manifold, onto the carbs first, not the manifold. Okay, so it's literally a case of getting them nice and square on the carburetors using the 9mm wide clamps, not the 12mm wide clamps. Okay, the 12mm wide clamps that we supply are for the manifold side. Okay, to be fair, you could use a 9mm one on there as well, but we supply 12. But the reason the narrow ones go on there is because there is not a lot of room on the carburetor to clamp down onto. If you try and clamp a 12mm one onto there, it will try and squeeze the hose off. Okay, so if these are new hoses and you put them on there squarely and you get those hose clamps up to the end as they are, okay, they will clamp down, and they will clamp down really well. So what then happens is over time these hoses actually shape to the shape that's on the carbs, and you get a groove in there, like a natural groove. So the hose will go on and off in the same position that it went on in the first place. So like I say, as long as you get that hose clamp right up at the top of the hose, okay, and you get the hose square on and tighten it up, it will be absolutely fine. The other thing to note is that you want to get the worm drive away from any parts of the carb body, because that can try and push it off. Okay, so as you can see, I've got them positioned sort of diagonally in this nice big space. It's avoiding as well any linkage components, because obviously these move, okay, so you don't want these worm drives to hamper the movement of that. Luckily this one moves downwards anyway, so it moves away from the clamp, but just be aware of that as well. It needs to not push onto the carb body anywhere, because that can try and push it off, and likewise it doesn't want to impede any moving parts. We've got the carbs back on the car now. Car is actually off my single post ramp. Somebody else's car is on my single post ramp. That's quite amazing. I think I bought that single poster 3 years ago. Only car that's been on there is my XR2. Not very good really. Anybody who knows me takes the piss out of me for that. But anyway, yeah, it's finally off the ramp and somebody else's car is on it, so maybe that ramp will make some money at some point. But anyway, back to the bike carbs. So obviously we balanced them on the test engine. We've now got them fitted back onto the car along with the base plate for the turbo plenum. So they're all bolted back together. That base plate actually holds the carbs together and tightens them all up. So I've just rebalanced them on the car to make sure they're right, because obviously everything's moved a little bit. But now that's bolted on, that is it. So we should have a nice idle. It's not quite warmed up yet, but I'll give it a start. Let's do the immobiliser. And show you guys how it's running. So we've got a nice idle, about 1000 RPM, as I said. It's not quite warmed up yet, but just go over and get the camera to show you the values on here. 5 on that one. Tricky to get it to show you, but it's 5 on there. A 5 on there. 5 on there, and a 5 on there, so they're pretty much bang on. So we're ready to put the trumpets in this plenum chamber now. So we've got some nice trumpets that will bolt straight in there, and then we have a revised plenum. So it had a plenum on it before, but the base plate and the design wasn't particularly great. So we've actually redone it now. So we've got this. So this is the old plenum, but with a new flange welded on there. Spent some time making a jig so we can skim these now, so that is nicely flat, bolt together design. Got a gasket ready to go in there, and it should be good. So yeah, I'm going to do a separate video on that though, on the turbo of the bike carbs. I just wanted to cover the basics of the carb balancing and setup and a bit of a refurb. So yeah, those carbs refurbed.